Halloween is a very popular time of the year, and it's all about trick-or-treating, dressing up, decorating the house, carving pumpkins, eating sweets, visiting haunted attractions, telling scary stories, and watching horror films. And although I can't do all of those things with you, there is one thing I can do, and that is tell some scary stories. So, from a man who killed his child with cyanide-laced trick-or-treat candy, to a paranormal story with footage that took place in San Pedro, California, here are a mix of 5 creepy stories. Some are real, some are myths, and some did in fact take place on and around the creepiest night of the year. The man who killed Halloween. This Halloween, like any other year, residents of Deer Park, Texas will be out with their children trick-or-treating. But what happened in this area will no doubt be in the back of their minds, bringing to reality the fact that just maybe some deprived stranger could again target innocent children with poisoned Halloween candy. Let's go back to the night of Halloween in 1974. 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien had spent the evening with his family at a friend's house in Pasadena, Texas. And Timothy's father, Ronald O'Brien, had volunteered to escort the children on their trick-or-treat rounds. When the O'Brien family returned to their own home, Ronald asked Timothy to choose a piece of candy to have before he went to bed, and suggested to him that pixie sticks was a good choice. After Timothy ate the sweet, he complained it tasted funny, so his dad made him some Kool-Aid to wash it down. Minutes later, Timothy started feeling unwell and went to the bathroom to begin throwing up and convulsing. Sickly, Ronald held his son before he went limp, knowing full well what the cause was. An ambulance was called and Timothy died en route to the hospital, less than an hour after eating his last piece of candy. Post-mortem reports confirmed that Timothy had been poisoned by a pixie stick laced with enough cyanide to kill 2 adults. Investigations centered around the local area and which houses had been visited during Halloween night. But after it emerged that Ronald had taken out life insurance policies on his 2 children shortly before Halloween, was in debt of around $100,000, had recently asked a chemist about poisons, in particular potassium cyanide, and even rang the insurance company on the morning of Halloween to ask about the payment of the policies, he became the number 1 suspect. Ronald was arrested and the jury took less than an hour to find him guilty and sentenced him to death. It really is hard to believe that someone could kill their own son for a life insurance policy. But just as shocking is that he had intended to kill at least 4 other children, including his 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth. But thankfully they did not eat the candy, which each had more poison in them, enough to kill 3 to 4 adults. Ronald was confined to the Huntsville unit on death row, where he was hated and dubbed the Candyman by fellow prisoners, up until his death by lethal injection on March the 31st, 1984. During the execution, hundreds of demonstrators gathered outside the prison, throwing candy bars and shouting "trick or treat." An Ouija board story. It's Halloween, which for some is no better time to dust off the old Ouija board and gather around the table with friends and family to try and speak with the spirits. But according to many, Ouija boards can be very dangerous and unpredictable, and for Carol Sue Alvaca, whatever happened whilst playing with one certainly didn't end well. It started on the night of February the 11th, 2001, when 53-year-old Carol, her daughter Tammy, and Tammy's 2 children were messing around with an Ouija board at their home in Minco, Oklahoma. Carol and the girls started their Ouija board session, but shortly after, Carol began acting very strange and out of character. Then, from out of nowhere, she picked up a knife, walked up to Tammy's husband who was asleep, and stabbed him in the chest. Why? She claims that he was evil and that God had told her to kill him by communicating through the Ouija board. Then Carol tried to harm Tammy's 2 children, insisting again that the board guided by God had instructed her to kill them both. Her daughter managed to take the knife from Carol, and for some reason hid it in the house before getting into the family car with her 2 children and Carol, who was behind the wheel. Carol then sped off at speed along the interstate heading towards Tulsa. Witnesses reported she was driving very erratically and she deliberately steered the car into a road sign in an attempt to kill herself and the rest of her family. All 4 of them survived, but Carol had broken both ankles. They got out of the car and she tried pushing Tammy's 15-year-old daughter into oncoming traffic, before leaping over a barrier, removing all of her clothes and disappearing into the nearby woods. Not long after, Carol was found cowering under a tree and taken into custody, where police were baffled at how she'd managed to leap the barrier and run into the forest with 2 shattered ankles. At her trial, the jury heard that Carol had no family history of domestic abuse, and there was no alcohol or drugs involved in her bizarre behaviour. Her actions were totally out of character, and she insisted that it was the Ouija board's fault and God had told her to commit the crimes. The event completely shocked the small community of Minco, even more so since Brian, the victim of Carol's insane act, ran for mayor in 1986. Jackie Hernandez and the Hanging Man. This next story starts with Jackie Hernandez and her 2-year-old son who moved into a bungalow in San Pedro, California, in November 1988 after a breakup in her marriage. Jackie was pregnant with her second child and was hoping for a fresh start with her child by moving there. But almost as soon as she moved into the property, a series of strange events occurred. Her bed kept collapsing with no explanation, she could hear mumbling voices coming from the attic, and her cat would run around the house appearing to be chasing something, but nothing was ever there. After her daughter Samantha was born, things got worse. Jackie started having vivid nightmares in which she was a man being clubbed to death in San Pedro Harbor, and on one occasion she said she woke up in the night to use the bathroom and saw an old man in her home, but before she could say anything, he had disappeared. Paranormal researcher Dr. Barry Taff and his team were called in, and they too backed up Jackie's claims, including the strange noises coming from the attic. Jeff Wheatcraft, one of the team members, went up there to investigate armed with a camera, and apparently an invisible force grabbed his camera and threw it to the ground. The team later came back to investigate further, and Jeff was again apparently targeted in the attic. But this time a clothesline was wrapped around his neck and he was pulled towards a nail in the rafter. Other members of the team acted quickly to free him, otherwise he believes he would have been strangled. These photographs were taken of the incident along with some video footage, and to Jackie's horror, a strange red mark was found on her child's forehead that wasn't there before. Now, there have been lots of skeptics claiming the whole thing is fake, but if it isn't, then it's definitely one of the creepiest videos out there. Take a look.
Going up there, but then I guess I'll go up. If I got a partner, why?
What's wrong? What happened? I told you, get down! Get down! Gee, this isn't a good idea. This isn't a good idea. This isn't a good idea.
Jeff, please get down. I gotta get out of here.
Whoa.
It's definitely raising hell. Jeff, please come here. Get this for me. Get the mic. Get the mic. Jeff, here you go, lady. Here you go. Here you go. What the hell happened? Are you okay, buddy?
At first I saw the look of terror on his face. I mean, it was just, he was just terrified. His glasses were gone, and then we saw like something like a cord that was around his neck.
It ended up over my head like this, and then it was twisted like this. I don't know how far or to what degree, but I know it was twisted because it was tied around my neck. And then it was hung up over the nail on one of the cross members that go across the attic.
Please, let's go. Please, what happened to her? Oh my God. I left that night. I never lived there again.
Pretty creepy, and there is more to the story. After Jackie left the house and moved back with her husband, it's alleged that the ghost followed her. After her relationship with her husband failed, the paranormal activity once again fired up. Investigators were called in an attempt to contact the spirit through an Ouija board, and the board told them that the spirit following Hernandez was a young man who had drowned in San Pedro Harbor in 1930. After further investigation, Jackie believes this was the young man in her dream. As for the old man she saw in the night, it's believed he built the bungalow in San Pedro and is thought to have been murdered. Jackie claims a ball of light led her to his grave when she lived there, and his name was John Damon. Jackie Hernandez has since moved back to San Pedro but into a different home, and as for the house where all the activity began, according to the owner of the place, no tenant has stayed more than 6 months, and reports of loud bangs coming from the attic continues along with other strange activity. Stanley Stiers. Everyone has probably at least heard of John Carpenter's famous film Halloween, and its main character Michael Myers, who murders his older sister and returns every Halloween night in a deranged state to terrorize and murder everyone in his path. Well, it's hard to believe that a character like Michael Myers could be based on a real person, but legend has it was very loosely based on a boy called Stanley Stiers. Now, this is just a legend, and I don't think the whole story is 100% true, but it's scary nonetheless. Stanley is thought to have been born in the early 1900s, and from the moment he was born in Iowa, his life took a dark turn. At birth, he was switched with another baby by an evil nurse, and his real parents and the switched baby were all killed in a car crash on their way home from the hospital. Shortly after, the parents who thought he was theirs found out he wasn't, and this was when the abuse and cruelty started. His parents were often drunk, and Stanley became a prisoner in his own home. He was not allowed to interact with other children, and things got worse for Stanley when his adoptive parents had a new baby, a girl they called Susie. They gave her everything Stanley craved, love, attention, and treated her like a princess. As she grew up, she also became abusive towards Stanley, but all of this would soon come to an end. It was Halloween Eve in 1923, and 11-year-old Stanley was told he wouldn't be allowed out trick-or-treating the next night. When his sister returned from a Halloween party later that evening, Stanley snapped. He took a butcher's knife and slaughtered everyone in the house, including the family dog. Stanley then stayed in the house with his massacred family lying around him, and prepared himself the next day to go trick-or-treating for the first time in his life. As he walked amongst the children in the streets on Halloween night, he picked out classmates who had bullied or belittled him and murdered them. Stanley was captured the next day when he was found eating Halloween candy sat on a swing. He was taken by federal agents and placed in a secret mental institution. All traces of the acts he committed were suppressed from the records and never released to the public. Stanley was studied for over 13 years in an attempt to understand what drove him to commit such heinous acts. Then, on Halloween night in 1936, Stanley snapped again, when two people at the hospital harassed him. Now, standing at 6'4" and weighing 260 pounds, he snapped their necks. Not long after, he used his strength to overpower federal agents and escaped the institution. He was never recaptured, and over the years, reports of random unsolved murders continued across the country, thought to be linked with Mr. Stiers. Buried alive. Halloween night is a popular time for people to wander through graveyards in hopes of hearing or seeing something paranormal. But just imagine hearing someone screaming and scraping from inside a grave that is buried deep underground. Just imagine the person in that coffin had been wrongfully buried. In this day and age, it's hard to believe that anybody could be buried alive, but years ago this was an alarmingly regular occurrence. Premature burial, as it was known, was rife, and in the late 19th century, such was the concern that a logbook was compiled. It recorded over 200 cases of near premature burial, 149 cases of actual premature burial, and 12 cases where autopsy or embalming had commenced before actual death. This happened because during these times, medical science was primitive, and a person could be declared dead just because they couldn't be woken up. It became such a concern that the wealthy people of the day demanded safety coffins, allowing the occupant to signal from inside the coffin if they woke up. This was usually some sort of bell or flag device that could signal to the outside world from 6 feet under that the person was actually still alive. But one of the eeriest cases of being buried alive happened in Pikeville in Kentucky in the late 1800s. The city had been plagued with an unknown disease which took the life of a lady called Octavia Hatcher's infant son, Jacob. Grief-stricken at the loss of her son, Octavia fell into a deep depression and took to her bed, where gradually she became very ill, and it was assumed she had been stricken with the same deadly disease that took her son. Octavia slipped into a coma and became unresponsive, and on May 3rd, 1891, she was declared dead. Due to the sweltering heat and lack of embalming, Octavia was quickly buried in the local cemetery along with her son. Just a week after her burial, many of the townspeople started to suffer the same symptoms as she did. The only difference was they were coming out of their comatose state and making a full recovery. Octavia's husband began to fear he had buried his wife alive and ordered the exhumation of his wife's coffin. When it was opened, his worst fears were confirmed. The lining of the coffin was scratched and torn to pieces, his wife's hands were covered in blood, and her fingernails were broken. Her face was etched with fear, and it was very apparent that she had been buried alive. Octavia's husband was horrified at what he had done and reburied his wife with a like-life monument over her gravesite, which is still in place today. It was later discovered that the mysterious illness was caused by an African insect bite that caused a disease known as sleeping sickness, and how many people were buried alive who had that disease remains unknown. So that is 5 horror stories. I was going to call it true stories, but the Stanley Stiers case is hard to validate. and whether you believe in the paranormal will determine if you think the Ouija board story and Jackie's story is real. But Ronald O'Brien did poison his son with trick-or-treat candy, and Octavia was really buried alive. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and don't forget to stay safe this Halloween.